At first, you have no idea how to coordinate. There's a specific set of movements for your hands and feet, all to be done in a certain rhythm. Of course, it doesn't click on the first try. In moments like that, you want to give up, because that's the easy way out. But we don't always choose the easy way. And once you catch that rhythm, when it all starts to flow, you finally find joy in every second and every beat. Life is exactly like that. Look at me. War, shelling, the loss of loved ones. Yet here I am, still learning to play the drums and even enjoying it. My name is Mladena. I'm 35 and I've lived in Ukraine my whole life. There's no guarantee that Ukraine will win, but we know one thing: if we give up, we'll definitely lose. So we have to keep doing everything we can, living our lives and fighting for that life. We are paying a heavy price for it, and still, every single time, we choose Ukraine.
On September 7th, 2025, during a massive overnight attack, a Russian missile strikes and destroys part of the building of the Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine. And although Russia destroys Ukrainian homes, businesses, and infrastructure every day, attacks like this bring them particular satisfaction, because these are strikes against the symbols of Ukrainian statehood. Over the 35 years of our independence, we have come a long way. We have had successes and suffered failures. We learned and failed to learn from our mistakes. We made choices and we defended them. We became who we are. And to understand this journey, it is sometimes worth looking back. Where did we begin? And how did we end up here? What made Ukrainians capable of standing firm where others gave up? And how can we preserve, during this war and after it, what we are fighting for, our dignity and our freedom? This is a story about the power of decisions and the choices that define Ukraine. On August 1st, 1991, the President of the United States addresses the Verkhovna Rada. His speech reflects the West's fears over the collapse of the Soviet Union. George Bush warns against suicidal nationalism and urges Ukrainians not to leave the USSR at any cost, but instead to seek compromise with Moscow.
Thank you very, very much.
3 weeks later, the blue and yellow flag is brought into the Parliament chamber. The Verkhovna Rada adopts the Act of Declaration of Ukrainian Independence.
It was an incredible precedent. In political or any other terms, it is best described as a miracle. That is why Putin is so furious and is trying to rewind history to that point, because he believes Ukraine's independence was an unfortunate turn of events, one that would not happen again if history were replayed.
On December 1st, a nationwide referendum asked one question: do you confirm the Act of Declaration of Independence? Over 90% of voters in every region of the Ukrainian SSR voted yes.
This is a hugely important milestone, because when they tell us now that maybe Crimea was never truly Ukrainian, come on, and that Donbass was somehow always oriented toward Moscow, seriously?
On the same day as the referendum, Ukrainians also elected their first president. Leonid Kravchuk won the election. But despite leaving the USSR, most state institutions and Soviet-era officials continue to operate with virtually no changes.
The new independent Ukraine did not start from scratch. It began deeply rooted in the legacy of the Ukrainian SSR. The communists effectively carried over into independent Ukraine not only Soviet norms, but Soviet political culture as well.
1993. economic chaos undermined public trust in the government. Inflation in Ukraine reached 10,000%. Social and political pressure was mounting, a scenario familiar to most post-Soviet republics in the early 1990s.
1993 to 1994, two tests of Russian and Ukrainian democracy. Two very similar episodes. Put simply, president versus parliament, and what happened. In Russia, a conflict broke out between the president and parliament. How did it end? The monarch sent tanks into the streets and shelled the parliament. In Ukraine, there was also a conflict between the president and parliament. How did it end? The president said, "Let's hold early elections," and he lost them. That is the moment that so profoundly distinguishes our two countries. And when people say that Russia was democratic in the 1990s, Yeltsin was in power, after all. Russian democracy ended in 1993. It lasted just 2 years, but ours still exists.
On December 5th, 1994, in Budapest, Russia, Ukraine, the United Kingdom, and the United States signed a memorandum guaranteeing security to Kyiv in exchange for Ukraine giving up its nuclear weapons. At the time, this was a key condition for Ukraine's integration into the democratic world.
You gave up under, encouragement, demands, and pressure in 1994 the post-Soviet nuclear arsenal that was in Ukraine. And you signed a memorandum in Budapest, and it had the word about assurance of the protection of your territory and sovereignty.
In June 1996, Ukraine officially lost its nuclear status. Its nuclear warheads and strategic aircraft were transferred to the Russian Federation, the guarantor of Ukraine's security. 3 years later, the Ukrainian authorities handed over 11 bombers and around 500 cruise missiles to Russia in exchange for a natural gas discount. During the full-scale invasion, Russia used this very weaponry to strike Ukraine.
The Budapest Memorandum was an attempt to strip Ukraine of its agency and security. It stands as proof that Ukraine was sometimes forced into actions it did not want to take. But the West too was mistaken, believing it could secure peace in Europe by pressuring Ukraine. This mistake simply needs to be acknowledged.
On June 28, 1996, in the 5th year of independence, Ukraine adopted its constitution. The basic law enshrined the country's sovereignty, but did not define its foreign policy direction. President Kuchma sought a balance. In May 1997, he signed a friendship treaty with the Russian Federation. In July, he signed a charter on special partnership between Ukraine and NATO.
Ukraine wasted a lot of time. There were 1, maybe 2 decades when Ukraine, instead of making a decisive turn in the direction of liberal democracy and in the direction of Europe, played with the idea that it was somehow a power in the middle, that it would get to, it was so big, it could get to make its own decisions. And all of that time, while they were pretending, one leader after another was pretending to be, some kind of deal maker, they were just losing time.
On March 25, 1999, Ukrainian politician Vyacheslav Chornovil died in a car crash. He was one of the leaders of the Ukrainian national movement and a potential rival to the incumbent president. The election campaign lost its main democratic candidate. In the second round, Leonid Kuchma faced communist candidate Petro Simonenko.
This was a Russian political tactic used in Kyiv. If I run against a real statesman candidate, I'll lose to him. So, using administrative resources, I'll pick a communist as my sparring partner, to force people to choose between me and a communist.
The year 2000, nearly 10 years of independent rule in Ukraine. Just for comparison, Putin was already president of Russia. Lukashenko had been ruling Belarus for 6 years. Leonid Kuchma was re-elected for a second term and, by the way, remains the only Ukrainian president to have ever achieved that. In all other Ukrainian elections, the opposition always defeated the incumbent. This ensured a constant rotation of elites, a kind of antidote to power usurpation. But it was during Kuchma's second term that he and his inner circle began devising scenarios to stay in power for a third term or even longer. They failed to take into account one very important factor: the opinion of Ukrainian society. In April 2000, President Kuchma initiated a nationwide referendum. The questions put to the voters were complexly worded and confusing for most people. In essence, they were designed to weaken the Verkhovna Rada's role as a counterweight to presidential power. Voting took place at almost empty polling stations. At the same time, the official results showed a turnout of over 80% and overwhelming approval of all the questions. For the changes to take effect, they still had to be ratified by Parliament.
This referendum was probably the first attempt at such large-scale electoral fraud in Ukraine, an attempt to hijack electoral mechanisms in order to push through political ideas that were very far from democracy.
On November 28, 2000, Socialist Party leader Oleksandra revealed materials in Parliament suggesting President Leonid Kuchma's possible involvement in the murder of opposition journalist Georgy Gongadze. 2 weeks later, thousands of people filled the streets, demanding the president's resignation and punishment for those responsible. This is how the Ukraine Without Kuchma protest campaign began.
We see a future, a Ukraine without Kuchma.
Amid public outrage and mass protests, the Verkhovna Rada failed to secure the votes needed to ratify the presidential referendum. The attempt to shift the balance of power collapsed. On March 9th, the commemorations of Taras Shevchenko's birthday became a pretext for a crackdown. The authorities resorted to force. Participants in the Ukraine Without Kuchma movement were beaten and detained en masse. This marked the first large-scale use of force against civic protest in independent Ukraine. On April 26th, the pro-Kuchma parliamentary majority dismissed the government of Viktor Yushchenko, the reformist prime minister whose public support had been rapidly growing.
We all supported Viktor Yushchenko. Maybe it went back to our school years in the 90s, when blackouts were a constant problem. The lights would go out, and we had to do our homework by candlelight. I clearly remember that when Yushchenko became prime minister, those blackouts stopped. We all felt the difference immediately.
On June 12, 2002, Viktor Matviichuk became head of the presidential administration. A lawyer and politician, he quickly emerged as a key figure in Kuchma's inner circle, wielding significant influence over state decisions.
Russian agents often posed as patriots. That was the core of Putin's strategy, and society supported them. I chose Matviichuk, and I was not wrong.
September 2002, the United States accused Leonid Kuchma's regime of illegally selling Kolchuga radar systems to sanctioned Iraq. The scandal sharply deteriorated Ukraine's relations with the West and led to the international isolation of the president, even though no evidence of the sale was ever found. On September 29, 2003, Russia began building a dam toward the Ukrainian island of Tuzla in the Kerch Strait, in an open violation of Ukraine's sovereignty. Kyiv decided to act. Border guards were deployed to reinforce the island, and construction was halted. Ukraine successfully repelled Russia's first attempt to change the border by force.
This entire story was part of a broader Putin special operation. Its goal was to prevent Kuchma from strengthening his grip on power. They feared that if Kuchma became like Nazarbayev, they would not be able to control Ukraine. They simply grew disillusioned with Kuchma because they believed he was building Ukraine for himself, not for Russia.
Following the cassette scandal, pressure on the media, and the exposure of corruption, the president's approval rating plummeted. Ukraine entered the 2004 election year with a deep distrust of the government. On the night of March 29, graffiti asking, "What is Kuchmism?" appeared on Independence Square and throughout Ukrainian cities. This is how the first campaign of the OPORA civic movement launched.
We were putting up stickers after dark on a street near the city courthouse. I stopped by a street lamp, looked left and right, nobody. I pulled out a sticker, slapped it onto a pole, and kept walking. Then I heard footsteps behind me. I turned onto my street, and the footsteps followed. I felt a hand on my shoulder. a flashlight in my eyes. I turned around. Police. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" They hauled me to the police station in a police van and counted every single sticker. Kuchmism is corruption, 153. Kuchmism is unemployment, 256. Even then, we were convinced the elections would be rigged and that we had to defend them. That very premise became the foundation of the OPORA civic campaign. Our mission was to protect the vote.
On April 8th, thousands of protesters gathered outside the Verkhovna Rada as Parliament voted on constitutional amendments. The reform, drafted by Kuchma's administration and pushed by Viktor Medvedchuk, aimed to abolish direct presidential elections and transfer that authority to Parliament.
Without a doubt, what is happening in this chamber today is not political reform. We all understand that perfectly well. What we are talking about is a coup d'etat. There are three men behind this coup: Kuchma, Medvedchuk, and Simonenko.
This was something that really could have driven us into authoritarianism. Votes were being gathered, quite literally, from the dead, the living and the unborn. I remember very clearly an elderly communist deputy who was taken from his hospital bed and carried into the Verkhovna Rada. He couldn't even walk on his own, but they needed him there to personally press that button.
The authorities fell 6 votes short of a constitutional majority. Their plan had failed. It meant the decisive battle still lay ahead: the presidential election. The ruling establishment backed Viktor Yanukovych, the sitting prime minister, and a representative of the Donetsk financial industrial groups. Opposition candidate Viktor Yushchenko stood as a symbol of change and therefore a threat to the old system. Ukraine was entering an election campaign that would determine not only its next head of state, but also the country's global trajectory. There was to be nothing noble about this political struggle. On September 5th, at the height of the presidential campaign, opposition candidate Viktor Yushchenko was admitted to a clinic in Austria. He was forced to suspend his campaign and returned to Kyiv only several weeks later.
When he came to the Verkhovna Rada, honestly, he greeted me in the lobby and I didn't recognize him. I simply didn't recognize him. As we understand now, back then, none of us had ever seen anything like that kind of poisoning before.
Look at my face. Listen to the way I speak. This is only a fraction of what I went through.
The Verkhovna Rada's commission investigating the poisoning was headed by Volodymyr Sivkovich, publicly portrayed as an unbiased politician. The case would remain unsolved. 20 years later, Sivkovich would be charged with high treason. US intelligence would confirm that Russian special services had laced Viktor Yushchenko's food with dioxin. By then, Sivkovich would already be in Russia.
Behind the facade of an election campaign lay a far more profound struggle for spheres of influence. It was a battle for Russian control over Ukraine, for Moscow's ability to dictate the country's future and determine exactly what it would look like.
On November 12th, President Kuchma dismissed 15 heads of district administrations in the regions where Yushchenko had won the first round.
By 2004, Viktor Yanukovych could not have won a democratic election in Ukraine. Despite all the resources the state poured into making him president, it was becoming obvious that he simply wasn't a winning candidate. That is why an unspoken decision was made. The election could and should be rigged.
During the second round of the election, observers documented widespread violations in both the voting process and the vote count. Meanwhile, independent exit polls pointed to a clear victory for the opposition candidate.
I was an election observer, and I remember it clearly. When the polling station closed, I had nowhere to go. I lived in a town outside Kyiv. So one of the election commission members, a woman, took me in. We slept for just a few hours. When she turned on the TV, there we were, in the home of someone I'd only just met, watching the results. Yanukovych had become president. I remember we both cried. It just felt so deeply unfair.
On November 24th, the Central Election Commission certified the official results. CEC chairman Serhiy Kivalov brushed aside numerous reports of fraud. In response, Viktor Yushchenko called for a nationwide strike.
Right now, from every corner of Ukraine, tens of thousands are heading our way. By ox cart, by car, by plane, and by train. This movement is only just beginning.
Student movements, trade unions, and business representatives joined the protests. Local councils across the country passed votes of no confidence in the Central Election Commission. Meanwhile, Interior Ministry forces and police units were deployed to Kyiv.
I wouldn't say the Orange Revolution was some kind of festival. It was just as frightening. There was no way of knowing whether weapons or force would be turned against the protesters.
The events in Kyiv gained widespread international attention. The US and Europe urged the Ukrainian authorities to reach a legal settlement. Meanwhile, Ukrainian courts were flooded with hundreds of complaints regarding election fraud. Opposition leaders coordinated their efforts, demanding a full review of the voting results.
That feeling that if we lost then, there would be no tomorrow, was absolutely decisive. It was part of the reason why society became so deeply mobilized.
Following the re-vote of the second round, Viktor Yushchenko emerged victorious in the presidential election.
It was pure euphoria, not just a feeling of victory. It was euphoria. My friends were crying, but I held back my tears.
The Orange Revolution taught Ukraine several vital lessons. The most important was this: the bad guys can and must be defeated. In 2004, our people derailed the plans of the Ukrainian authorities, their Russian handlers, and the system's behind-the-scenes players, all those who believed they were the ones in control. In the end, society had the final say. Some lessons would only become clear with time. For instance, that swift victories do not guarantee rapid change, or that even disappointment can become experience. 6 months later, President Viktor Yushchenko signed a memorandum with Viktor Yanukovych, pledging not to prosecute political opponents over the events of the 2004 election.
We agreed to leave all of that in the past. How was that possible? When it was bandits to prison, there was fraud. The third round happened because the second was rigged. If there was fraud, someone had to pay for it.
On December 14th, 2005, in response to the Maidan experience, a civic organization emerged to focus on election monitoring and protecting voting rights.
OPORA was built by a generation that had been active in the revolution. We were idealists, but we quickly realized that street protest alone could become marginalized. We understood that new policies had to be created.
On January 8, 2008, the Party of Regions and the Communists blocked the proceedings of the Verkhovna Rada. Pro-Russian political forces launched a large-scale campaign against Ukraine's NATO aspirations. The blockade of the parliamentary podium lasted 47 days, the longest in the history of the Ukrainian parliament. In parallel, mass rallies were organized to spread fear and disinformation about the alliance and demand a referendum, fostering public resistance to Euro-Atlantic integration.
It was a very difficult situation. Society back then was underinformed and heavily influenced by Russian propaganda, and by political groups in parliament who kept portraying NATO as something terrifying. Now, an overwhelming majority of citizens support membership, but it came too late.
At the Bucharest summit, Ukraine failed to receive a membership action plan. Germany and France opposed the move, and one of their key arguments was the lack of public support within Ukraine, something that had been publicly demonstrated over the preceding months.
These were colossal missed opportunities that led us to the point of no return and to war. Between 2005 and 2008, Ukraine should have done everything in its power to join NATO. Everything.
Viktor Yushchenko became the first president to consistently pursue a state policy centered on Ukrainian national identity. He initiated the recognition of the Holodomor as the genocide of the Ukrainian nation. He also reintroduced key figures of the liberation movement, Roman Shukhevych, Stepan Bandera, and the Ukrainian insurgent army soldiers into public discourse.
Many people didn't even understand what he was talking about. He was mocked, openly ridiculed. At the time, it was all perceived very differently. But if it hadn't been for that, I don't think we would have defended ourselves the way we did as a society.
First and foremost, I appeal to the national idea, for it is the only key to a dignified life for all Ukrainian citizens and for the Ukrainian state as a whole.
At that moment, in 2009, what could possibly go wrong?
Flying over Khreshchatyk is the world's heaviest aircraft, the An 225 Mriya.
Everything was great. We were young, inspired, and studying at the best university. It was at Kyiv Mohyla Academy that I met my future husband, Ostap. We were raised to believe that we weren't just studying to land a good job and make money. We were getting an education so we could change this country for the better.
I hear everyone, and I am ready to help each of you.
On February 7th, 2010, in the second round of the presidential election, 12.5 million Ukrainian voters cast their ballots for Viktor Yanukovych.
It was as if 2004 had never happened, as if all that fraud and abuse simply didn't matter. That was likely the moment I realized most clearly that the values of democracy, respect for human rights, and freedom of speech, our values, often play a cruel joke on those who actually uphold them.
On February 25th, Russian Patriarch Kirill conducted a service at the Kyiv-Pechersk Lavra. At Yanukovych's invitation, he blessed the presidential inauguration.
Godspeed. Many said that people would never take to the streets again, but I was among the journalists who maintained that new mass protests were inevitable. I was certain of it. I believed that as soon as Yanukovych upset the balance, and he was bound to do so because he was too dependent on Moscow, mass protests would break out.
On April 27th, smoke bombs and fistfights erupted inside the session hall of the Verkhovna Rada. Shielded by security guards, Speaker Volodymyr Litvin put the ratification of the Kharkiv Accords to a vote. The agreement, which extended the presence of Russia's Black Sea Fleet in Crimea until 2042, became a symbol of Moscow's political resurgence in Ukraine.
Passed with 236 votes.
The Kharkiv Accords were the prologue to the Great War, a war that reached its peak in 2022 with the full-scale invasion. Had Ukraine rid itself of the Black Sea Fleet, had the Ukrainian parliament defended our sovereignty by refusing to host a foreign military on our soil, the occupation of southern Ukraine in 2022 would not have been so effortless. Perhaps Mariupol would still be free today.
On September 30th, the Constitutional Court overturned the reforms that had limited presidential powers. Viktor Yanukovych secured absolute power in Ukraine.
He was legitimately elected, but once he had power, he sought to change the nature of the system. He sought to change the system so that it benefited him and his family and his friends and his political grouping, so that instead of having fair and even elections and having open public debate, he tried to change the system so that he would be the victor.
With less than 2 months until the local elections, the authorities rewrote the electoral laws in their favor. The Party of Regions seized control of election commissions, and independent candidacies for mayors and local deputies were banned. As a result, the Party of Regions won majorities in most regional and city councils across the east and south, while also making significant gains in central Ukraine.
OPORA was the only Ukrainian NGO that refused to recognize the local elections as legitimate or democratic. Essentially, the law itself was designed to sideline virtually any opposition candidate, a tactic that was used extensively. In practice, the opposition had no leverage to defend their rights or participate in the elections on a level playing field.
On October 11, 2011, Kyiv's Pechersk District Court sentenced Yulia Tymoshenko to 7 years in prison. For the first time in Ukraine's history, an opposition leader was sidelined from the political process through a criminal conviction.
I had, I think, 17 lengthy meetings with President Yanukovych. I had probably 28 meetings with Prime Minister Azarov. To do with the question of some political prisoners and what was regarded by Western jurists as selective justice.
Viktor Yanukovych's regime centralized every sphere of the state. The family, as his inner circle was unofficially known, controlled customs, the tax service, the largest state banks, and Naftogaz. Half of all public procurement was conducted without tenders, sending corruption to historic highs. Ukraine ranked 144th in the world. The Mezhyhirya estate and Yanukovych's Honka mansion remain, now preserved as a museum, symbols of the regime's systemic greed. While entrepreneurs took to the Maidan to protest tax pressure and opposition leaders remained behind bars, loyal oligarchs controlled the major TV channels, and independent media faced constant pressure. Yet, against this backdrop, negotiations for European integration somehow persisted, slowly, against the grain, but still offering a glimmer of hope. March 2012. Ukraine and the European Union finalized the text of the association agreement. Preparations for its signing begin. July 2013, hundreds of Ukrainian trucks and thousands of rail cars are stranded at the border with Russia. Moscow shifts to direct economic pressure, launching an overt customs war against Ukraine.
Facing mounting pressure, Yanukovych was forced to make a call. On one hand, the decision aligned with his own convictions. On the other, it was a direct result of the leverage held over him. The core of that pressure was clear. The era of ambiguity was over. He had to choose, and he made his choice. He chose Moscow.
On November 21, 2013, Ukraine's Cabinet of Ministers issued a resolution to suspend preparations for the signing of the association agreement with the European Union.
I was sitting in class, scrolling through the news, when I saw the announcement. I felt like everything was collapsing. You just realize that that's it. We're simply sliding into a dictatorship.
On the evening of November 21st, the first protesters began to gather on Independence Square.
Today, a few hundred will gather, perhaps 1,000. Tomorrow, 10,000. The day after, 100,000. And then, millions will rise. This is our only chance to save this country.
On November 24th, the largest opposition rally under the Yanukovych presidency took place.
Let Vilnius hear us. We, Ukrainians, are part of the great European family. Ukraine is Europe.
On November 28th, a 2-day Eastern Partnership Summit began in Lithuania, where the association agreement was slated to be signed.
And practically everything was agreed, and your bureaucracy and administration was ready to sign. but only president rejected. And even during the same evening, we still had hope. We were negotiating with him why he's not signing, and he was saying that Russia threatened with economic measures, and it is very expensive, and it will cost for Ukraine billions of euros. Merkel said, okay, we will pay. And he did sign anyway. So we understood that it is more than money, that it is, the threats from Russia was for him probably also personal, very much.
The Vilnius summit concluded without the agreement being signed. Student movements were gradually forced to scale back their street protests. On the night of November 30th, the Berkut Special Police Unit violently dispersed the demonstrators.
It made no sense
that Berkut would show up and disperse everyone with such brutality.
After the students were beaten, it wasn't about the EU anymore. It was about the limits of power, what the government can and cannot be allowed to do.
On December 1st, people from all over Ukraine flocked to Kyiv. Self-defense units began to form on the Maidan. Following a rally of 500,000 people, protesters occupied the city administration and the trade union's house. On Bankova Street, almost directly under the president's windows, clashes erupted with law enforcement. The Maidan's central demand was now the resignation of the authorities. On December 8th, protesters toppled the Lenin monument on Bessarabska Square.
Personally, I felt like, finally, it had happened. But I remember very clearly the heated debates it sparked, even among those on the Maidan. Some thought it might be a provocation, something that could lead to a split, that it shouldn't have been done. But in truth, it reflected the mood of the vast majority of people there. At that moment, toppling the idol felt like another step toward victory. Because, unfortunately, victory was still a long way off. There were still many more weeks of standing in the streets without any visible result.
When Ostap and I were on the Maidan, near the student camp by the main post office, everyone had a role to play. Some worked in the kitchen, feeling that what they were doing mattered, making tea or feeding others. Some handed out leaflets. Others followed the news feeds. Even simply being present, especially during the assaults, in those moments of acute crisis. Just standing near the stage, being there together, was a vital part of this shared effort.
On January 16, 2014, the Verkhovna Rada adopted the so-called dictatorship laws in blatant violation of parliamentary procedure. Voting by a show of hands and without a proper tally, lawmakers sharply restricted civil rights and freedoms, banned peaceful assemblies, criminalized participation in protests, and made it easier to repress activists.
I asked the chairman of the Counting Commission to announce the results of the vote. 235 votes in favor.
They deliberately moved toward escalation, but they miscalculated how people would react. For those in the center of Kyiv, there was a perimeter of freedom. Stepping outside that perimeter could mean death, a beating or torture. What happened to Verbitsky, to Ihor Lutsenko, who survived, to Tanya Chornovol? People simply had no other choice left. The authorities didn't account for that.
At the core of Ukrainian identity lies a profound sense of freedom. This is, of course, what distinguishes us from our neighbors, from Russians, obviously. In Russian political culture, freedom is seen as something dangerous. The Tsar must rule over everything. Coercion is the only way to hold society together, while freedom is viewed as destructive. In Ukraine, we feel that without freedom, we simply cannot exist.
January 19th went down in history as the baptism by fire. Following the adoption of the dictatorship laws, the protests escalated. Tires burned on
Hrushevskoho Street
as prolonged clashes with security forces broke out. On January 22nd, news broke of the first Maidan protesters to be killed. Serhiy Nihoyan and Mihailo Zhizhnevsky.
By the end of January, we were truly afraid for our lives. There were so many detentions. People were being snatched up, and later, bodies were being found in the woods. You started to realize that this might not end well at all.
On February 18th, the revolution reached its decisive turning point. The peaceful offensive march toward the Verkhovna Rada devolved into bloody clashes in the government quarter. In a single day, more than 24 people lost their lives.
The only capital city in Europe, in my memory, that had people out protesting with European flags for a European vocation was here in Ukraine. The only capital city in Europe where people were shot dead holding European banners with a vision of the future. People who died with an idea of Europe, the Heavenly Hundred. The only place that happened was in Ukraine.
On February 20th, snipers in the heart of Kiev opened fire on protesters. Dozens were killed. The oldest was over 60. The youngest was only 17.
We lost a close comrade on the Maidan that day, Bohdan Solchanik. Back in 2004, he was the one who led tens of thousands of students to the Maidan during the Orange Revolution. 10 years later, in 2014, he found himself on that same Maidan during the shootings and was among the first to fall. This was not a generation that wanted to die for Ukraine. It was a generation that wanted to act and to live for Ukraine.
Anyone who stands against the system, anyone who tries to assert their own agency, takes on enormous risks, even the risk of death. All the repressions in Soviet Ukraine targeted one specific trait: agency. Those who asserted agency, those who showed leadership, were the first candidates for elimination. For many paternalists, this was, and remains, an argument for passivity. But over time, it became clear that passivity is what actually guarantees destruction. Taking action increases the risks, yes, but it is also the only way to create new conditions, conditions under which we may ultimately all be safer.
On the evening of February 21st, the leaders of the opposition signed an agreement with Viktor Yanukovych to resolve the political crisis. They agreed to hold early presidential elections by December 2014. The Maidan was not having it.
77 people gave their lives, and they're making deals? Yanukovych is not staying president for another year. He must be gone by 10 a.m. tomorrow.
Under the cover of night, Viktor Yanukovych fled his Mezhyhirya residence and left the country.
I was surprised when, President Yanukovych fled the country. It's interesting how frequently the pro-Russian, and they're not really pro-Russian actually, they're sort of pro-corruption, the pro-corruption, pro-Putin parts of the society, and they're there, how quickly they gave up.
Russia got exactly what it wanted. Remember, when that agreement between the opposition and Yanukovych was signed, it was Russia that did everything possible to ensure Yanukovych left Kyiv. It was Russia. They wanted him to flee without formally resigning, specifically to delegitimize Ukrainian statehood.
On February 22, 2014, the Verkhovna Rada adopted a resolution declaring that Viktor Yanukovych had removed himself from his presidential duties. Ukraine returned to a parliamentary presidential system and called for early elections. Even at a moment of extreme turbulence, the country managed to ensure a civilized transfer of power. This proved critical, as Russia has systematically promoted a narrative that Ukrainian authorities are illegitimate ever since Yanukovych fled. In 2025, this narrative was even echoed by US President Donald Trump, who called Volodymyr Zelensky a dictator without elections. Nevertheless, it is clear that on a global scale, Putin's gamble on a failed state and the delegitimization of Ukraine has failed. On February 20th, 2014, the very day of the deadliest shootings in Kiev, unmarked trucks and armed Russian soldiers without insignia appeared in Crimea.
Crimea surprised me, but it showed that was so well prepared. That is not something that they woke up on some day in February or March and said, let's do it. That surprised me, because I read those things because I'm interested in the geopolitics of the region.
In late February, Russian troops seized the buildings of the Crimean Parliament and the Council of Ministers. On March 16th, under armed control and without the presence of international observers, a sham referendum on joining Russia was held on the peninsula.
Russia actually understands very well how important elections are as a way of legitimating power. That's why they have fake elections in Russia. That's why they hold fake referendum in occupied territories. Of course, it's also why they seek to manipulate elections in other places.
On March 27, 2014, the United Nations General Assembly adopted a resolution refusing to recognize the annexation of Crimea and reaffirming its status as part of Ukraine. While international institutions expressed concern and support for Kyiv, they stopped short of taking the decisive steps necessary to halt the aggression.
I was the first and alone, because then I said that after Crimea occupation that Russia is behaving as terrorist state. I was criticized at home. I was criticized abroad and in the West that I'm too hawkish, that I'm too aggressive, and everybody want to keep calm. So, and I was under pressure.
On April 12th, Russian sabotage groups seized the Ukrainian cities of Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, and Druzhkivka. Fighting erupted in the Donbass.
That Friday, I was watching the news. More grim reports about the events in the east, and I knew it was time to go. A brother in arms with the call sign Kulok called me and said, "When you get to Starobilsk, give me a shout." I asked him what I should bring. He said, "Well, just get some good boots. We've got clothes, so just good boots and body armor." I managed to find good boots, but tracking down body armor back then was a different story.
We and I proposed the lethal weapons to your government. And I remember that not from the very beginning that your defense ministry was saying, no, we don't need it. And I called your president, Poroshenko, saying, look, I'm proposing you ammunition, and your ministry is saying that they don't need it. Free, we're not selling, we're giving you our ammunition. So in reality, it was not easy, and for you to create your country from scratch and to create your defense capabilities, because in the very beginning, after Maidan, it's only patriots and so-called national patriots who were defending your country, and the military was very weak.
Starting in 2014, it was precisely out of the volunteer movement and former Maidan activists that a truly Ukrainian army began to take shape, what we now know as the Armed Forces of Ukraine. An enormous role was played by individuals who had never planned on a military career, who perhaps had never even seen themselves as soldiers, but who stepped up and took responsibility. The fact that today we have an army capable of holding back Russian aggression is the direct result of those who, back in 2014, chose to take responsibility for transforming this sphere.
On May 25th, early presidential elections were held, with Petro Poroshenko winning in the first round. Despite the ongoing war and the loss of part of its territory, Ukraine successfully secured a democratic transfer of power. In the parliamentary elections that autumn, the Communist Party failed to cross the threshold into the Verkhovna Rada for the first time since independence. The parliament was significantly renewed, with numerous civic activists entering its ranks.
I used to call them semiconductors. It's a term from physics, meaning they were already capable of transmitting the right impulses within those party structures, but they weren't yet able to change the structures themselves.
This time, an active civil society effectively became a co-creator of the state itself, helping shape new rules and driving key reforms. In 2014 and 2015, new anti-corruption bodies began operating in Ukraine. The judiciary and the prosecutor's office were overhauled, and transparent competitions for civil service positions were introduced. It was during these first post-Maidan years that, thanks to structured cooperation between civil society and the government, Ukraine succeeded in implementing systemic changes that had been stalled for years. On July 4, 2015, 2,000 new patrol officers took the oath on Sofievska Square in Kyiv. With the enactment of the law on the national police, Ukraine's old post-Soviet militia officially ceased to exist. Around the same time, the lustration law, one of the key demands of Maidan, came into force.
By then, it had all become irreversible. It was completely obvious that if we didn't want that bastard running the show, simply protesting against him wasn't going to cut it. People in civil society began thinking long-term. It was no longer about just ousting an official, but about rethinking policy as a whole.
On April 9, 2015, the Verkhovna Rada adopted a package of decommunization laws. For the first time, the laws opened the archives of Soviet repressive agencies, and the Soviet totalitarian regime was officially condemned at the state level.
Looking at the 2014 map, showing the removal of Lenin monuments, we can see very clearly that sooner or later, the entire territory of Ukraine was bound to align with this westward trajectory. And that was precisely the point when Russia attacked, to halt this progress.
In 2016, a large-scale healthcare reform began. The year also saw the launch of the Prosto system, a procurement platform created by a coalition of civic activists, business leaders, and the state, which effectively blocked billions in corruption tied to public procurement.
I was invited to join Uliana Suprin's team.
Ostap
Began working for an anti-corruption NGO. I believe he was one of the best experts on anti-corruption policies.
In the summer of 2017, the visa-free regime between Ukraine and the European Union came into effect. This was the result of fulfilling dozens of requirements, from security reforms to the introduction of biometric passports.
We have these moments of crisis, moments like the Maidans, when the state and civil society draw closer and begin working in synergy, helping one another. But afterward, they return to their natural positions. Civil society starts saying the state is alien, imperial, Soviet, and occupying in nature. And the state says that civil society is just getting in the way of it getting things done.
On July 31st, 2018, civic activist Katerina Hanzyuk was attacked with acid in Kherson. In May of that same year, an assassination attempt was carried out against Serhiy Sternenko in Odessa, the third such attack in just 6 months. Between 2017 and 2018, more than 50 attacks on civic activists were recorded across Ukraine. Most of these cases were never properly investigated, and those who ordered the attacks remained unpunished. An information campaign to discredit civil society was actively driven by a consolidated media holding made up of the News 1, 112, and Zik TV channels, which were acquired one after another by Viktor Medvedchuk. In the lead-up to the 2019 presidential and parliamentary elections, these media outlets systematically promoted pro-Russian narratives, criticized Ukraine's European course, and backed a pro-Russian political comeback, even pushing the idea of reconciliation with Russia.
Hello, Ukraine. Greetings, Russia. We need to talk.
This reflected the tolerance of Ukrainian society toward differing opinions and opposing views. But, as it turned out, we weren't tough enough. And of course, the Russians took advantage of that.
These people didn't just drop out of the sky like aliens. That was the public mood at the time. The overwhelming majority of Ukraine's population remained part of the Russian civilizational space and the Russian worldview.
On April 21st, 2019, Volodymyr Zelensky won the presidential election with 73% of the vote. A comedian, actor, and political newcomer, he ran as an anti-establishment candidate.
I am dissolving the Verkhovna Rada of the 8th Convocation. Glory to Ukraine.
On July 11th, 2019, during the final days of the Verkhovna Rada's 8th convocation, Speaker Andrii desperately urged lawmakers to vote for the draft electoral code.
At the briefings, everyone was in favor. It was in every party platform, and it was in the coalition agreement. And now, disgracefully, you refuse to vote for it. I have no other word for it. It's a disgrace.
The law was passed on the 17th attempt. The code introduced open electoral lists, marking the culmination of more than a decade of relentless effort by Ukrainian and international civil society organizations to make elections more transparent and accountable. In 2020, the Democracy Index recorded significant progress for Ukraine in political competition and electoral pluralism.
The level and quality of competition within our political process placed us alongside developed democratic societies. The year 2020 proved that society, civic organizations, and civic movements that had defended Ukraine's democratic and electoral processes had achieved real success.
I know before you have the next presidential election or Rada election or, regional and municipal elections, I know one thing for certain. I don't know who will win. Because this is an open, contested democracy. And that is the difference. The fact that you don't know who will win, even the powerful ones who think they can win don't know if they can win, is the proof. This is not Russia.
On January 24th, 2022, the US State Department urged the families of American diplomats in Kyiv to leave Ukraine.
Even international humanitarian organizations were evacuating their staff. They assessed Ukraine's ability to withstand external aggression solely by the strength of its state institutions, and they realized those institutions simply were not strong enough. What they failed to understand, lulled by their own worldview, was the strength of the people standing behind those institutions. The people who said, yes, the Ukrainian state is imperfect, but this imperfect state is our only way to survive and remain Ukrainian. And that is why we will stand by these state institutions. We stood with them and we defended the Ukrainian state.
On February 24th, 2022, Russia launched a full-scale military invasion of Ukraine.
When Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, it was an admission that it had failed by all other means. Because wherever Russia can use other methods, as it does in Belarus, Georgia, or Moldova, it uses them. The fact that it resorted to war against such a large country with such a massive population meant that all its other methods had failed. And while this was undoubtedly the result of a combination of factors, above all, it was because this society never said, "I am nobody here."
In the first hours of the full-scale invasion, the Verkhovna Rada enacted martial law across Ukraine.
The invasion happens. All the armor is coming down out of Belarus. You don't know will you win or you lose in this blitzkrieg that's planned. And your leaders don't know will they live or die. The Rada met in plenary session at the beginning of the war, and the Rada did its duty to the nation. Every member of the Rada was for a death squad or a gulag if it went differently. And they stood their ground and they did their duty. Look at what happened in Afghanistan. The president gets in a plane and goes to Abu Dhabi or Dubai or something. And all the troops say, which if the president goes, why should I die for this? And they gave up all the arms that they had been trained to do to fight Taliban. So it is underappreciated, I think.
Ostap asked me, what do you think I should do? Should I enlist or not? I told him that I couldn't make that decision for him, because it had to be his choice. The only thing I could say was that I would support him in whichever decision he could live with afterward. His choice was to go to the enlistment office as a volunteer and join the military.
Today, as we live through war, when the price of decisions is so often measured in human lives, it becomes clearer how the history of our choices has also been the history of our coming of age. In 1991, Ukrainians instinctively chose freedom. In 2004, they stood for justice, believing it could be achieved peacefully. In 2014, they chose dignity and for the first time truly felt the weight of freedom. The choice of 2022 was definitive. It was the moment when the very existence and independence of the Ukrainian state became the daily responsibility of millions of its citizens.
We have a rich history, and time and again we lost our struggle to have an independent state here. And more often than not, we lost because of a lack of unity within, because of internal conflict. That is how we fell at the end of the Kievan Rus era. That is how we lost during the ruin, when we failed to bind together the right bank and the left bank. That is how we lost the liberation struggle of 1917 to 1921. I'm not saying it was our fault back then. Again, we faced an immensely powerful, terrifying enemy. Perhaps no other society could have withstood such pressure. But in the face of such a powerful enemy, we must understand that despite all our diversity, richness, plurality, and disagreements, there are moments when preserving unity must come before everything else.
On May 3rd, 2022, pro-Russian political parties were officially banned in Ukraine. In March 2023, the law on decolonization marked the first time Russian imperial policy was officially condemned at the state level.
War forces a great number of people to understand what evil really is. And that evil must be called by its proper name. Not long ago, we walked down streets named after our executioners. These were people who killed us in horrific ways. Yet we accepted the fact that this evil was not only unpunished, it had been memorialized, embedded in our public space. The war accelerated the understanding that we must finally draw a line between good and evil.
On April 12, 2022, the Security Service of Ukraine detained Viktor Medvedchuk. After more than 20 years in high politics serving Russia's interests, he finally proved useful to Ukraine. Medvedchuk was exchanged for 200 Ukrainian prisoners of war. On July 1st, 2022, the flag of the European Union was carried into the parliamentary chamber. Shortly before, the European Council had granted Ukraine candidate status for EU accession, a political recognition of the path the country was forging at the cost of war.
Never in the history of independent Ukraine has there ever been such strong support for democracy as a system of governance, or for membership in the EU and NATO. Never. Through this pain and bloodshed, we have truly learned who our enemies are and who our friends are. Yet it is deeply tragic that some will never live to see the final outcome simply because others failed to understand who the real threat was. We never talked about the possibility that he might not come back. The only serious conversation about what could happen was when he told me, "I've listed you as my emergency contact in case I'm wounded or killed." We wanted to finally live a little for ourselves. And honestly, we wanted to travel more. We realized how many things we had put off, caught up in this constant rush, in all these socially important causes. In our personal lives, we had postponed so much, and we desperately wanted to make up for lost time.
On February 4th, 2026, President Volodymyr Zelensky stated that 55,000 Ukrainian soldiers had been killed in the war.
This is a war for the freedom to preserve our own identity, rather than having Ukrainian children re-educated as Russians. And it is a war for the freedom to make our own democratic choices, to continue building a country where the rights of every individual are protected.
On July 22nd, 2025, just a block away from the office of the president, several thousand young Ukrainians took to the streets in protest. The day before, Volodymyr Zelensky had signed a law restricting the autonomy of the country's anti-corruption bodies.
For me personally, this was important because I know how many of my friends, the people I stood with during the Maidan of 2004 and 2013 to 2014, have been in the military since 2014, and how many of them, tragically, have fallen. There was always this fear: is there a next generation ready to defend freedom within the country against overreach by those in power? That is why, overall, I'm glad that the government received this signal from society, that there is still the strength and the will to say stop to any attempt to go too far in rolling back democracy.
On October 29, 2023, regular parliamentary elections were scheduled to take place in Ukraine. Presidential elections were set for March 31, 2024. Local elections for October 26, 2025.
As long as martial law remains in effect, we cannot hold national elections. But is Ukraine a democracy? Absolutely. Is Ukraine a totalitarian prison camp? No. If you want to see what a totalitarian prison camp looks like, look at Russia.
Russia uses the electoral cycle pause as a hybrid warfare tool, pushing the narrative that the Ukrainian government is illegitimate.
Ukraine's election cycle cannot be determined by Russia. It is not any of Russia's business when Ukraine holds elections. And actually, I think most people do understand that. I don't hear huge cry for Ukraine to have elections, except from these pro-Russian bots on social media and some pro-Russian people in the United States.
On December 9th, 2025, US President Donald Trump publicly called for elections to be held in Ukraine, despite the ongoing war.
If somebody who pushes you now to go for elections, no matter what, I think they're not talking about democratic elections. If you think about elections as a democratic tool, that means they need to be democratically organized. In martial law situation, then you have about 10 or I don't know exactly how many millions people outside of your country in the battlefields to organize democratic elections, and very well, I think it's very difficult.
In this war, we are defending our choice, because democracy is our choice. And what is remarkable is that during this intense phase of the war, people have become even more convinced that democracy is the system of governance Ukraine must have. As long as we remain a democracy, we still have a chance to resist a massive, highly aggressive state that has made our destruction its ultimate goal.
The Ukraine we have today was shaped choice by choice. Every step, every political decision carried consequences, even if they were not immediately apparent. And now, too, our future will depend on our next choice. It will certainly not be an easy one, but what matters most is that it remains our choice. That is the essence of it, the factor of choice, Ukraine.
Розфасуй кохання по флаконах і приймай, коли так б'є біди.
In the end, it all comes down to one thing. You have to stay on the side of good. Because otherwise, what is it all for?